So Drewby asks, is 5-color domain even possible on a budget? That's my question. All right, Drewby, don't worry. I've got an old favorite from this channel, and we are going to utilize him to his fullest so that we can make a 5-color domain deck on a $15 budget be a reality just for you. So, we are going to be using Omnath, Locus of All. Omnath says that if we would lose unspent mana, that mana becomes black instead, and at the beginning of our pre-combat main phase, look at the top card of our library, reveal it if it has 3 or more color symbols, and if we do add 3 mana in any combination of colors, but in any case, we put this card into our hand no matter what. That said, let's go ahead and go into what we are going to be doing to build 5-color domain on a $15 budget. Those who have been following this channel for a while, Omnath, Locus of All should look like a good friend. Omnath was, of course, the first Wooburg commander deck that I built on this channel, and if you remember from that deck, I basically built him as a Gates deck with a lot of heavy-handed X-cost spells as the primary win condition. Now, this Omnath deck is going to be very different, but I will provide a link to that video in the description below if you would like to check it out. I will give a fair warning, though. The deck list for that deck has changed a lot, and if you check the Moxfield link in the description of that video, you will see the updated deck list for the original Omnath Locus of All that I built. This is because anytime I make changes to a deck, tweaks to a deck, when I realize that a deck needs something and I've been playing with it and it needs to go through the fine-tuning process, then I end up fine-tuning it in Moxfield so that people who want to pick up the deck will get whatever the most tuned version of that deck is. Also, as new cards are released, if I don't make a video follow-up, I might still have made a follow-up in Moxfield. So just check out decks that I make in the description below. That's basically what I gotta say. But today, we are playing Omnath as a domain commander instead of a Gates commander. So Omnath is normally great for X-cost spells, and we are still going to be doing that, but we are going to be having a heavy focus on domain. What is domain? Well, it's this little ability right here. You get some kind of benefit for having multiple basic land types on the battlefield, usually all the way up to 5, and we are going to be trying to use this for maximum benefit in our deck as well. As a result, we've got a really interesting mana base that I think more people should be trying out for Wooburg decks now that we have access to so many freaking good cards from Modern Horizons 3. So let's get into what we're going to be doing. Domain yields itself really well to having a lot of lands on the battlefield, so we will be building a Landfall style deck. This means that anytime a land touches the battlefield, we will have some type of big thing happen. But that's not all. We also need other haymakers besides that. So let's go with the classic ones from the original deck. Debt to the Deathless, which says each opponent loses 2 times X life, and then you gain life that was lost this way. Debt to the Deathless is already a very good card in any kind of big mana deck, but because Omnath allows us to store all of our unspent mana at the end of every turn, we can basically go, hey, I have 10 lands, because most of my ramp has been going full force. Tap those 10 lands, store that 10 mana. My turn comes up, I have 10 mana again, because I've untapped my mana. Let me go ahead and tap all of my lands. I have 20 mana. I'll spend 4 of that on the colored mana and 16 of that on Debt to the Deathless, dealing 32 damage to every player and gaining us an obscene amount of life, where I don't want to do the math for it, because math is for blockers, and we will not be attacking if we win with Debt to the Deathless. We also have Villainous Wealth, where if we store enough mana and cast it into Villainous Wealth, we can basically storm off another player's deck. This makes target opponent exile the top X cards of their library, then we can cast any number of spells with mana value X or less from among them for free. So we dump 10 or 12 mana into this, go ahead and exile the top 9 cards of somebody's library, and then suddenly we have a ton of cards available to us. Very, very powerful card. But we also need to make sure that Omnath stays on the board long enough to store that mana for us, so to facilitate that, we have Mirror Shield and Giant's Amulet, where these cards will basically just give Omnath the ability to have hexproof. Mirror Shield also gives immunity to Death Touch effectively, but that's not really important for this type of deck. We're not swinging with Omnath. Also, there is a tokens sub-theme in this deck that I want to get to real quick that is very, very important for our ability to win the game. You see, even though Debt to the Deathless is a fun top end to close out the game, sometimes people have enough life to survive. So we've got 8 cards that will give us tokens when we landfall that will be able to get us closer to winning the game. Beginning with Maja, Bredegard Protector. Other creatures get 1/1, and whenever a land touches the battlefield under our control, we make a 1/1 white human token. Retreat to Emeria also makes 1/1 white core ally tokens, while also giving us the ability to lord 1/1 to all of our creatures with landfall as well. We just pick which one we want. If we already have a big board, just get multiple landfall triggers on pumping that board up 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and then swing out with the giant board. Vreston makes use of the X cost storage from our commander. This enters the battlefield with X 1/1 counters on it, and whenever it enters the battlefield, we create X green and white alien insect creature tokens. Also, whenever we attack with one or more insects, all of our insects get a 1/1 counter on them, meaning that they will at the very least swing for 2 the first time that they swing. Emeria Angel makes 1/1 white bird token creatures, and I think you've noticed that a lot of our tokens are very, very evasive. But we have some more non-evasive tokens in Zendikar's Royal. This gives us 2/2 green elemental creature tokens. Omnath of Rage, which makes 5/5 red and green elemental creature tokens, and if any of our elementals die, Omnath will deal 3 damage to any target, giving us another way to close out games. Rampaging Baloth says that if a land enters the battlefield under our control, we can create a 4/4 green beast creature token. If our tokens are not evasive, they are huge. Elsewise, they are something a little bit more modular, like what we get with Necrobloom. Some of you have probably already seen the myriad of decks I've built with this guy, but Necrobloom has a landfall ability to make 0/1 green plants, and if we have 7 or more lands with different names, it'll instead make 2/2 black zombie creature tokens, and it gives all lands in our graveyard Dredge 2, which can sometimes be relevant, but we don't need to worry about that too terribly much in this particular deck. But with all these tokens, we need a way to guarantee that they get in there and win. Obviously, Maja and Retreat to Emeria are doing plenty of work in that regard. Vestrin is doing lots of work in that regard. Omnath's tokens are big enough to be a threat on their own, but we also have Tromp the Domains, and Tromp the Domains is our first domain card we got to talk about in the deck proper. Until end of turn, creatures we control get trample and 1/1 for every basic land type we control. So since we are a domain deck, that will be 5. That means that if we've got 10 1/1 creatures, this is now 50 to 60 damage on board with trample. This is closing out the game for at least one person, and that's assuming we're using just 1/1s and we only have 10, which we can make much more than that in our deck. Tromp the Domains is a wonderful win con, and it does guarantee that our opponents will lose to specifically the domain flavor of the deck. But that is not everything we are doing. We also need to make sure those tokens can get in there, so we've got 2 haste enablers. We have Fires of Yavimaya. This gives all of our creatures haste, and also we can sack it to give a creature 2/2 until end of turn if we desperately need it. And Torrent of Souls, which will let us revive one of our token generators, and also give all of our creatures haste. It gives creatures target player controls 2/0 and haste until end of turn. This could just win the game on its own. It really has a lot of power behind it. But it's not the only way we have to recur cards. We also have 3 other cards that are built to recur stuff for us, beginning with Bortuk Bone Rattle. This domain card says when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, choose any creature card in our graveyard. Return it to the battlefield if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of basic land types among lands we control, which of course is 5. So that's most of our token generators pretty easily. We also have Quest for the Necropolis, Landfall. When a land touches the board, we can put a quest counter on this, and we can sacrifice it to put a creature from a graveyard onto the battlefield under our control, and this ability costs 1 less for every quest counter on Quest of Necropolis. We get a bunch of lands on the board, suddenly we're paying basically 2 mana, and getting a creature from anybody's graveyard. Then we have Emeria Shepherd, flying, landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, take a non-land permanent from our graveyard and put it into our hand. But if the land we drop down is a plains, instead we will put that card directly onto the battlefield. Emeria Shepherd is a fantastic and very powerful card that if you have access to it in one of your decks, you already know the kind of power that it wields. But we also need to make sure that we can get to these wonderful top-end cards, so let's talk about drawing cards. Now, while our commander does have the ability to draw us plenty of cards in a pinch, we don't want to rely only on that, because if our deck only relies on our commander, we will basically fold if it dies too many times. So we have a 12-card draw engine to get through the rest of our deck, beginning with Shadow Prophecy, a domain card that says we look at the top X cards of our library, where X is the number of basic land types we control, and put 2 of those cards into our hand and then lose 2 life. The rest of them go to the graveyard. Super simple. We're basically paying 3 to dig 5 cards deep and grab 2 of those cards at instant speed. For 1 penny, I will buy that. Then we have Nail Evisa Aeronaut. This is another domain creature. Anytime it deals combat damage to a player with its flying booty, we get to look at the top X cards of their library, where X is, of course, the number of basic land types we have. Put one of those cards into our hand and the rest of them onto the bottom of the library in any order. It says put that card on the top and then draw a card, which matters in very specific situations. Functionally, you're just grabbing one of those cards and getting it for free. Lore Ruin Expedition, landfall. Whenever a land touches the battlefield, we can put a quest counter on it. After 3 quest counters, we of course get to sack it and draw 2 cards. Worldly Council has a domain before domain was a keyword. Look at the top X cards of our library and put one of those into our hand. It's identical to Shadow Prophecy, but it costs 1 less and puts things on the bottom instead of into our hand, instead of into the graveyard. It's also getting us 1 fewer cards, but for 1 less mana, that's entirely fine. Then we have Allied Strategies, another domain card from pre-domain. Target player draws cards equal to the number of basic land types they control. Stroke of Genius is an X card, where we pay 3 and X to make target player draw X cards. Transcendent Message is a pay 4 and X card, and Transcendent Message has Convoke, so if we have blue creatures on the board, or any creatures at all, we can tap them to further the cost of Transcendent Message. Tatiova Benthic Druid, whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we gain a life and draw a card. In an ideal world, we should be able to trigger this card 3 to 4 times a turn if we have the right hand size for it, meaning we'll be able to dig several cards deep into our deck. Sphinx of Clear Skies is a fantastic domain card with flying and ward 2. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we reveal the top X cards of our library, X's domain, and our opponents shift those cards into 2 piles. We put one of those piles into our hand and the other into the graveyard. It's basically fact or fiction, but, you know, a Sphinx. Expansion Explosion can deal X damage to any target and then draw X cards. As a result, it also has the ability to copy an instant or sorcery, which can sometimes matter when, say, rebutting counter spells or stuff like that. Hydroid Krasis lets you draw half of X cards, and it gives itself X/1/1 counters. So if you pay 10 to the X, it'll be a 10/10 flying trample, and we will gain 5 life and draw 5 cards. I'm so happy this card is 20 cents now and not like $8. Then we have Tireless Tracker. When a land touches the battlefield under our control, we get a clue token. If we sack clues, we make Tireless Tracker bigger, but that doesn't really matter all that much. All that matters is that we're getting lots and lots of clues, and we can sink mana into those clues. As a good example of when to do that, if somebody's about to kill Omnath and we're about to lose all of our stored mana, just sink all of that stored mana into these clues, draw a bunch of cards, and then take your turn with probably a fresh clutch of 7 at that point. Otherwise, clues are just good draw when you need them anyway. I like Tireless Tracker. That said, let's go ahead and start blowing up our opponent's cards. While it is important to be able to accelerate ourselves to winning the game, we also need to make sure our opponents do not have the ability to win the game out from under us. So to facilitate that, we've got at least 10 removal spells with a bunch of board wipes to back them up. Beginning with Drag Down, this has Domain. A creature gets -1/-1 for every basic land type that we have. This means for 3 mana, we have the ability to make something go -5/-5, which may not seem like a great rate of return until you remember that gets around indestructible, and there's plenty of times where that will matter a ton. Also, Artillery Blast deals X damage to a tapped creature where X is 1 plus the number of basic lands we have. Domain, of course. Decimate allows us to blow up an artifact, creature, enchantment, and a land. Mortify lets us blow up a creature or an enchantment. Despark lets us get rid of an permanent with mana value 4 or greater. Binding the Old Gods blows up a non-land permanent an opponent controls. It also allows us to get a forest later on, and also gives us Death Touch to all of our creatures on the 3rd round, which is a very easy way to just flat out win, because nobody wants to block a bunch of death-touching creatures. Abstruse Appropriation has Devoid. We can exile any non-land permanent, and then cast that card for as long as it remains exiled if we use colorless mana to substitute for colored mana on the card. Now, when you get to land base, you'll understand why this part will be so easy to do. Utter End is the original version of Abstruse, exiling a non-land permanent. Putrefy blows up an artifact or a creature, and Territorial Carvu has Domain. Whenever this attacks, we choose one. We either discard a card and draw a card, or we exile any target card from a player's graveyard. Territorial Carvu also, very importantly, has Domain, so he is a 5/5 for 2 mana, which is super easy to start threatening people with very early on. But these are not the only ways we have to remove things from the board. We've got a few other ways to do that as well, and these are all super big board wipes. Let's look at them as we go. We have 4 of them, beginning with Drag to the Bottom. Of course, it is a domain card. Each creature gets -X, where X is 1 plus the number of basic lands we control. 4 mana to give everything -6. That's pretty easy to do, and that's gonna wipe most problems off of a board. Gaze of Granite is an X-cost board wipe that blows up every non-land permanent with mana value X or less. We lose a lot to this, but because unlike other WooBurg decks I've made, we are relying entirely on land grabbing, we won't lose mana rocks to this, but we can use this to set other decks back a ton and prevent ourselves from losing a game outright. Then we have Martial Coup and White Sun's Twilight. They're basically the same card, but let's go over them. Martial Coup, you pay 2 and X into, create X/1/1 White Soldier creature tokens. If X is 5 or more, blow up all other creatures. White Sun's Twilight does the exact same thing, except it gives us X life and also gives us toxic creatures when we do that. So, let's say you've got White Sun's Twilight, and you cast it, and you've got a Fires of Yavimaya. If X is 10, which is easy to do, because you don't have to have 10 mana for X to be 10, we just have to have mana stored on Omnath. This means we can go ahead and blow up all the blockers on the board. The Phyrexian Mites touch the board automatically. They have haste because of the Fires of Yavimaya, and they swing out to eliminate at least one player out of the game. If X is high enough, then we can just eliminate all players out of the game, or the 2 most problematic players out of the game. Either way, this is a board wipe that has a baked-in win con when we have enough mana to make it so. Even without haste, White Sun's Twilight can just win us a game and is well worth using 1/15 of the deck's budget to try to cram this in. But we still want to make sure we've got plenty of mana, so let's get into how we're going to be facilitating that miracle. We are straight up running 15 pieces of ramp in this deck in order to get Domain online as fast as possible and get enough mana for the X cost part of our deck to matter the most. So let's get into each of these cards and what they are doing. Slimefoot Survey has Domain. Search your library for 2 land cards. Any land cards, by the way. Any land cards. As long as they have a basic land type, drop them onto the battlefield tapped, then look at the top X cards. X is Domain, of course, so it's going to be 5. Put any of those cards on top of our library and the rest on the bottom in any order. Now remember, our commander has a top of deck ability, so we can use this to guarantee that we get the free mana from Omnath if we need it. But again, most of the time we're just using him for that draw and the mana storage. Charitable Levy can make it's a good stacks piece. Non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast, and if a player casts a non-creature spell, we put a counter on it. After there are 3 counters, we sack it, draw a card, and then search our library for a plains, and then also just shuffle our library. This is important because when we grab a plains, we're going to get a dual land instead of just getting a basic plains. Map the Frontier gets 2 basic lands or deserts onto the battlefield tapped. Exploding Borders has Domain. This searches our library for a basic land card, puts them in play tapped, and then deals X damage to a player, where X is the number of basic land types we control. So we're going to deal 5 damage to a player, which is a non-insignificant amount in Commander. Path of the Animus gets 2 basic land cards onto the battlefield tapped, and then it's got a Planeswalker ability that we are just going to ignore. Spring Bloom Druid sacks one of our lands to get 2 different basic lands onto the battlefield. Colony Heart Expedition gets 2 lands onto the battlefield after it's got 3 quest counters from Landfalling. Explore the Underdark gives us 2 basic lands and then another one into our hand when we take the initiative. Wayfarer's Bauble comes down early and sacrifices itself to get a basic land to the battlefield. Search for Tomorrow can be cast for Suspend on turn 1. Otherwise, it just gives us a basic land onto the battlefield untapped. Wood Elves grabs any forest from our deck and puts it onto the battlefield untapped, which is super important because we have, again, dual lands that are typed. Then we have Cultivate, search your library for 2 basic land cards and reveal them, put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand. Explosive Vegetation grabs 2 basic land cards, as does Migration Path. We have a lot of grab 2 lands because we desperately want to make sure that we have a lot of mana to sink into X spells. Then we have Soul of Windgrace. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, put a land card from our graveyard onto the battlefield tapped under our control. We can also discard lands for gaining 3 life, or drawing a card, or giving him indestructible. Most of the time, he's going to come down and get one of our fetch lands, and then he's just going to do his thing until people realize they need to get rid of the cat that's keeping us in the game for a very, very long time. So remember, the reason we have so many cards that get double lands is because we've got so many cards with Landfall, and it's so imperative to turn our otherwise muddling Domain cards online. We need to make sure that we have Domain available. Like, Tromp the Domains ain't gonna do shit unless we have all 5 lands to make it as powerful as it possibly can be. But as far as our lands are concerned, we are running 17 basic lands. 5 forests, 3 of each island, plains, mountain, and swamp. This is because, well, we have 15 fetching lands. 15 of these beautiful babies. Let's go ahead and get into each of these. Of course, Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse and Escape Tunnel are in here because they all can just come out of the battlefield, sack themselves immediately, and get a land. Myriad Landscape can get 2 lands, effectively ramping us, and then we have Crows and Verge, which can also get 2 lands at the exact same rate as Myriad Landscape. But K-Verge gets a plains and a forest, so we can get 2 of our dual lands out with this. Past that, all of our lands are the landscape cycle. Contaminated, Twisted, Shattered, Perilous, Bountiful, Tranquil, Seething, you know the drill. You can see what they do. They come onto the battlefield untapped, meaning they are fast as fuck. They can sacrifice themselves at the exact same rate as Evolving Wilds, and we can cycle them if we are so late in the game that we need to find different cards. The dual lands that I've chosen to run are all the Tango lands, and that is it. Canopy, Vista, Prairie Stream, Sunken Hollow, Smoldering Marsh, and Cinder Glade. The only reason we're running these is they come into play untapped when we have 2 or more basic lands, which is what most of the deck is comprised of, and they are typed lands. We want our lands to either be fetching us stuff or to be typed. We want nothing besides those in the deck, with few exceptions. And those exceptions are the Omni lands, Exotic Orchard, and Command Tower, followed by a utility land in Pit of Offerings, which will give us a modicum of graveyard control as we need it. Comes into the battlefield, exiles 3 cards from a graveyard. If you are running a deck that needs lots of mana colors, Pit of Offerings is great. If you're not, it's also great as a budget Bajuga Bog. I think more people should be running this card. It is wonderful, and it is very worth coming into play tapped for. That all said, we do need to talk about what would happen if you had a bit more of a budget to sink into this lovely, lovely piece. Now, this is already a fairly flavorful deck since we are running 2 Omnaths in it, but if we wanted to go for extra flavor, why don't we go ahead and add more Omnaths in the upgrade section. If we're ignoring budget, Omnath, Locus of Mana, is another way to keep our unspent mana as we need it. Omnath, Locus of Creation, of course, gives us a super good set of landfall triggers, and Omnath, Locus of the Royal gives us more landfall triggers in the form of draw. Scion of Draco is also super on theme, and it gives our Omnath some wonderful abilities as well. And we've got Exsanguinate, which is another way to close out our games. We also can draw more cards if we stack in an AC on top of our Tatiova, and a Valakut Exploration gives us a nice mix of Impulse Draw and, of course, Burn if we need it. Then we have the Tireless Provisioner, which also gives us treasure tokens when we landfall. We can protect our commander better with Swiftfoot Boots, Lightning Greaves, and Collective Restraint. And our removal package will be better served if we upgrade some of our clunky removal with Generous Gift, Beast Within, Stroke of Midnight, and of course the domain-centric Ley Line Binding. We can also go ahead and upgrade our tokens package with Avenger of Zendikar and Green Sleeves Morrow Sorcerer, and our burn package can be upgraded even further with an Ob Nixilis the Fallen if you are so inclined. That all said, those are a whole bunch of suggestions if you wanted to go a bit further with the deck without a tight budget, but how are we feeling about this deck? In conclusion, this was a bit of a hard one, but you know what? I'm not gonna lie. It was a fun challenge. Domain doesn't have all the best cards possible for us, and 5-color decks on a budget are always a bit of a challenge to build. At least they were before Modern Horizons 3 basically gave us the cheat code in the landscape lands that we have. Now that we have access to those, I don't know if it's actually ever going to be hard to make one of these decks ever again at the budget that we are looking for. But this deck has plenty of win conditions, tokens that get haste, infect, big ways to burn, casting things from our opponent's library, and of course, it's all supported by a domain primary theme with a landfall substituting theme so that we always have access to tons of good cards. The domain cards give us access to draw, removal that gets us round indestructible, and of course, one of our primary win conditions in Tromp the Domains. I hope you guys enjoyed this deck. I enjoyed making it. I'm not gonna lie, I made it while sitting at a table in a Buffalo Wild Wings with some friends, scrolling through my YouTube comment section. I saw the comment and I just went, huh, I need to brew that. And it was in front of Biminem, and Biminem, of course, runs Domain in Modern. So he was basically helping me bounce off ideas like, hey, maybe you should run this, maybe you should run that. And this is what I ended up coming up with a little bit of supplemental help. The entire deck clocks in at $15.80, with, of course, the first dollar of that being shaved off by the commander itself. I love making these decks at this budget. It's a super fun building challenge. That said, let me know what y'all think in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you haven't already, and as always, everybody, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here. They would be Red Joker, Blitzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Mabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, Sagitt, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.